They said it was a curse, whispered through the streets of Pennsylvania like a warning no one dared speak too loudly. The Holloway family name was tied to wealth, power, and prestige, but also to madness. Every wife who stepped into that grand house, every woman who laid her head on the Holloway pillow, ended the same way. Brilliant, beautiful, full of life when she entered, and broken, shattered, and consumed by insanity when she left. Men called it coincidence, priests muttered of demons, doctors scribbled down words like hysteria and melancholia. But if you peel back the polite lies and the Victorian explanations, you'll find something else, something darker. Because patterns like this don't happen by chance. They happen when a design is at work, a system, a deliberate shaping of minds until they crack. And here's the part they didn't want you to know. The Holloway curse wasn't superstition. It wasn't the devil. It was the weaponization of psychology before psychology even had a name. A man turning his own home into a machine of control, and once you understand what was done inside those walls, you'll never look at marriage or madness the same way again. The Holloway mansion stood on a rise above the town, its windows catching the sun like eyes that never closed. Locals admired its wealth, but avoided walking too close after dark. They said you could hear voices behind those windows, whispers that weren't quite human. But inside, it wasn't ghosts that destroyed the wives. It was something far worse. Each new bride was drawn in by Thomas Holloway's power. He was tall, commanding, a man who could make anyone feel small just by standing near them. To the public, he was respectable, generous, untouchable. But power has layers, and what he showed the world was only the mask. Behind closed doors, Holloway believed he had discovered a science no one else dared pursue. The human mind, he told confidants, could be reshaped like clay. You didn't need chains to imprison someone. You only needed to bend their reality until they doubted their own thoughts. His wives were experiments. One by one, he tested the boundaries of control. Sleep deprivation disguised as devotion, mirrors arranged to distort perception, carefully planted suggestions whispered at night. What broke them wasn't madness, it was design, calculated, controlled, and terrifyingly effective. The first wife, Eleanor, never saw it coming. She believed she was marrying into privilege, stepping into a gilded life that would lift her above the rest of the town. For a time it seemed true. The mansion glowed with chandeliers and imported wallpaper. Servants waited on her hand and foot. But beneath the glamour, Holloway was already tightening the invisible noose. He began small, isolating her from her family under the guise of protecting her reputation. Then he altered her sleep, insisting that true refinement meant rising at odd hours to align the body with higher rhythms. She began waking in the dead of night, half dreaming, half awake, confused and unsettled. That confusion became his tool. By the third month, Eleanor was seeing patterns in the wallpaper, faces in the firelight, shadows in the mirrors that never matched her movements. And when she told her husband, he leaned close and whispered, "Yes, my love, the house is speaking to you. You must listen." What looked like sympathy was manipulation. What seemed like concern was control. Within a year, Eleanor Holloway was declared insane. But the truth? She wasn't born mad. She was made that way. After Eleanor was carried away to the asylum, Thomas Holloway didn't mourn. He prepared. Within months, he courted again. His second wife, Catherine, was brighter, more skeptical, harder to sway. But Holloway had refined his methods. He knew exactly how to dismantle resistance. To Catherine, he played the role of a visionary, speaking of hidden sciences, ancient knowledge, and truths about the mind that common men couldn't grasp. She thought she was privileged to glimpse his private world, not realizing she was stepping into a trap. The mirrors were his favorite weapon. He had them placed in every room, polished to a cruel brightness. Catherine confessed to friends that she felt watched, as if her reflection lingered a half-second too long. Holloway encouraged her unease, telling her, "Reflections are windows, my dear. Some show more than others." Soon she was staring into glass for hours, trying to catch what shouldn't be there. The more she doubted herself, the more he fed her explanations. By the end, Catherine was begging to have the mirrors removed, but Holloway refused. He told her the mirrors were teaching her. What they were really doing was breaking her mind until she collapsed into the same abyss as the first wife. By the time the third wife arrived, people in town whispered but dared not accuse. How could three women from different families, different temperaments, all collapse into madness in the same house? Holloway had answers ready. He spoke of fragile female nerves, of hereditary weakness, of unfortunate coincidences, and because he was wealthy, respected, and powerful, the town believed him. Or rather, they pretended to, because in every small community, there are things everyone knows but no one says. The third wife, Marianne, was stronger than the others. She was lively, defiant, unwilling to bow to her husband's rules, and that made her a greater challenge. Holloway escalated. He manipulated her environment with precision. Rooms were rearranged without her consent. Servants repeated his words back to her as if they were hers. At night, she swore she heard footsteps echoing her own, though the halls were empty. Her breaking came not with screams, but silence. She stopped speaking altogether, convinced that her thoughts were being stolen the moment she voiced them. When neighbors finally saw her again, she was gaunt, pale, and trembling. Holloway called it a tragedy of feminine delicacy. But to those who dared look closer, it was no tragedy, it was a ritual. By now, the Holloway mansion itself had a reputation. Families avoided letting their daughters linger near its gates. Servants whispered that the walls breathed at night, that voices carried through the pipes, though no one spoke. Yet Holloway pressed forward, each new marriage another experiment, another test of how far he could push the mind before it snapped. His fourth wife, Lydia, came from money equal to his own. This time, he sought not just beauty or spirit, but status. With her, the manipulation took a colder shape. He didn't charm her with whispers. He undermined her with precision. He would correct her in public, then privately accuse her of imagining the humiliation. He would move objects in her chambers, then swear they had never been there at all. It was psychological erosion, calculated gaslight before the word even existed. Within months, Lydia questioned her own memory, her own senses. She began keeping journals, desperate to prove to herself that she wasn't losing her mind. Holloway found them, read them aloud to her, and told her, "You see, even your words betray you." She burned her writings in despair. The last record of her thoughts turned to ash, just as her sanity did soon after. By the time the fifth wife entered the Holloway mansion, whispers of a curse had hardened into quiet fear. People crossed the street rather than pass its gates. Mothers told their daughters not to stare at the windows after dusk. But Holloway thrived on that fear. It made him untouchable. Respectable society still welcomed him at dinners and applauded his donations, while pretending not to notice the trail of broken women in his wake. Power protects itself, and his was ironclad. Her name was Annabelle. Younger than the others, radiant, ambitious, Holloway knew she was the perfect vessel for his next experiment. With Annabelle, he refined the cruelest technique of all, convincing her that her madness was her destiny. He whispered to her about the Holloway wives, about how each had been chosen to glimpse truths ordinary women could not endure. Instead of resisting the visions, Annabelle embraced them. When the walls seemed to breathe, she called it revelation. When the mirrors whispered, she thought it was prophecy. By the end, she wasn't screaming or resisting. She was laughing, eyes wide, convinced she had transcended the human condition. To outsiders, she was insane. To Holloway, she was proof that his system worked. 5 wives, 5 minds shattered, and yet Thomas Holloway was never accused, never tried, never even questioned with real suspicion. Why? Because the world protects its architects of control. Because society would rather label women hysterical than admit a man of power had engineered their downfall. The asylum doors swallowed them whole, and Holloway walked free, celebrated as a gentleman, a patron, a visionary. But in his private journals, those that survived in fragments, you see the truth laid bare. He wasn't hiding his methods, he was perfecting them. He wrote of rhythms of sleep and light. He charted how hunger weakens will, how repetition plants false memories, how mirrors fracture identity. He noted which techniques caused breakdowns quickly and which allowed the subject to function while still being controlled. Holloway's words read less like a grieving husband and more like a scientist sharpening his instruments. These weren't wives to him. They were vessels, experiments, proof that reality itself could be bent until even the strongest spirit bowed to his design. And here's the part that should unsettle you most. His techniques didn't vanish with him. They were noticed, they were studied, and eventually they were scaled. What began in the Holloway mansion didn't die there. Ideas this potent never do. They spread quietly, invisibly, until they shape entire systems. Look at the methods: isolation, gaslight, deprivation, suggestion, mirrors of identity turned against the self. These weren't just cruel experiments on wives, they were blueprints for control. And if you think they stayed locked in that house, you're fooling yourself. As the decades passed, psychology emerged as a science, and men in ivory towers discovered principles that Holloway had already tested in secret. Government institutions noticed: prisons, asylums, schools, later, corporations. They saw the efficiency of breaking someone without touching them. Why waste chains when you can convince a man he never had freedom to begin with? Why silence a voice when you can make him doubt the words in his own mouth? The Holloway curse was never supernatural, it was institutional. The same tools that reduced women to shadows in a gilded cage became the same tools that taught generations how to obey. What happened to those wives was only the beginning, and if you look closely at your own life, your own world, you might start to see those same invisible hands shaping you. Now I need you to see what's been hidden in plain sight. The Holloway wives weren't just victims of a cruel man, they were the first to endure what would later be called systems of compliance. You live inside those systems today. Think about it. Schedules that strip away your natural rhythms, media that repeats the same lines until you doubt your own instincts, mirrors everywhere, screens, reflections, curated images that tell you who you should be until you stop recognizing who you are. The mansion has grown larger, but the design hasn't changed. And here's where you come in. If you've followed me this far, it means you're not like the rest. You feel the weight pressing against your mind. You notice the cracks in the facade. So I want you to lock in this moment. Comment the phrase "I see the mirrors" twice below, not for me, for you. Because when you declare it, you step out of the role of subject and into the role of witness. You stop being one more Holloway wife and you start becoming something else. The question is, what do you do once you see the design? Do you run from it or do you learn to use it? When you strip away the polite lies of history, you see that men like Holloway weren't accidents, they were prototypes. Every empire, every institution, every so-called authority learns the same truth eventually. It is easier to control perception than to control flesh. A locked door can be broken, chains can be cut, but if you convince a man his prison is necessary, he won't try to escape. He will guard it himself. The Holloway wives were taught to distrust their senses, to question their own minds. That's the essence of control. Make someone doubt what is real, and they will cling to the very system that destroys them. Tell them it's love, tell them it's safety, tell them it's destiny. Holloway wrapped his cruelty in the language of devotion, and the world applauded his respectability, while his victims crumbled. And here's the danger: you live in a mansion just like theirs. Maybe not with chandeliers and marble halls, but with glowing screens and endless rules that seem normal. How much of your daily life is yours, and how much has been scripted for you? How much of what you believe is truth, and how much is conditioning? Think of the mansion as a symbol, a grand house, polished and respected, admired from the outside, but inside it devoured lives. That's how control always disguises itself. It wears the mask of progress, of refinement, of civilization. The wives thought they had entered a paradise. They had actually walked into a cage. Tell me, how different is your world? You're surrounded by mirrors of illusion, advertisements promising freedom but selling dependence, leaders speaking of safety while feeding fear, systems of education that reward obedience but punish originality. The pattern is identical. The Holloway story is just an early chapter of a much larger book, one that has been written across centuries, and every chapter begins the same way, with a promise, a better life, a higher status, a safer future. That's how the trap is set. That's how men and women step willingly into their cages, believing they chose it. The wives lost their grip on reality because someone redefined it for them. Look closely. Hasn't the same been done to you? When you question what you've been told, you feel that flicker of unease, the same way they did in front of the mirrors. That flicker is the beginning of awakening. If you don't look away, the Holloway curse was never about spirits trapped in mirrors. It was about men trapped in illusions, women stripped of their will, and a society too afraid to face the truth. But if you've stayed with me this far, you already feel it, the resonance between their world and ours. What broke those wives is the same pressure pressing against you now. Silence when you should speak, doubt when you should trust yourself, chains that aren't made of iron but of expectation. And here's the deeper danger. Once a system proves it can bend perception, it doesn't stop. It grows, from one house to an asylum, from one asylum to a city, from one city to an entire nation. Holloway's little experiments with mirrors were the seed. The forest of control you live inside today is its growth. Every advertisement, every speech, every rule of behavior, tiny manipulations of reality designed to keep you docile, distracted, and divided. But there is another path. If you study the systems, you stop being their victim and begin to see their architecture. And once you see the blueprint, you can decide, remain one more prisoner in the mansion, or learn how to tear its walls down. Picture the final Holloway wife standing before her mirror, eyes wide, whispering to a reflection she no longer trusted. That's not madness. It's the human mind rebelling against an imposed reality. When the pattern becomes unbearable, the psyche fractures. Some collapse, some lash out, and a rare few awaken. That's where you stand now. History isn't just something you watch, it's a script they want you to follow. But you have a choice. You can break the mirror. Every system of power fears the same thing, a man who sees the design and refuses to play along. That's why propaganda exists. That's why distractions multiply. That's why fear is manufactured. They need you docile, predictable, staring at your reflection until you forget who you are. Holloway's wives couldn't escape their mansion, but you can walk out of yours if you're willing to face what waits outside. The cost of awakening is high. It means loneliness, it means struggle, it means rejecting comforts others cling to. But the reward is clarity, and clarity is power. The mansion only wins if you keep staring at the mirrors. When you turn away, you take back your mind. The Holloway mansion still stands, though its windows are dark and its halls silent. Tourists call it haunted, but the real haunting isn't in the bricks or the glass. It's in the pattern that outlived the house. The techniques perfected there echo across time, shaping the way nations govern, the way institutions condition, the way corporations sell. The curse wasn't a family's misfortune, it was the seed of modern control. Think about your own reflection. How much of what you see is truly yours? How much was handed to you by others, your habits, your beliefs, your desires? Holloway used mirrors to fracture the minds of his wives. Today, the world uses mirrors made of screens, algorithms, and endless comparisons. The result is the same: confusion, dependence, surrender. But there is power in knowing. Once you recognize the design, you can no longer be trapped by it. That's why this story matters, not as a ghost tale, but as a warning. What destroyed those women is the same force trying to erode you. The difference is, you've seen it now. You've walked the halls of the mansion without losing yourself. That makes you dangerous to the system. This is where it ends, or where it begins, depending on what you choose. The Holloway mansion is only a ruin now, but its legacy surrounds you. Every lie repeated until you question yourself. Every authority that tells you it's for your own good. Every reflection that doesn't quite look like you. The curse is alive, not in the walls of that house, but in the design of the world you walk through every day. The wives had no way out. Their voices were dismissed, their minds rewritten, their lives consumed. But you aren't trapped in their century. You aren't bound by their silence. You can name what's happening. You can step outside the pattern. That's the real forbidden knowledge, awareness itself. And once you hold it, nothing, no government, no institution, no whisper in the glass, can fully control you again. So here's my last request. If you've heard the echoes of this story and felt the chill of recognition, mark yourself. Write in the comments, "I will not be broken. Not for me, for you." Let it be the first crack in the mirror they've built around you. Because the moment you claim those words, you do what 5 wives never could. You break the curse,